when somebody asks what's the benefit of virtue of philosophy, I think, well, that gigantic mountain of human intellectual and empirical achievement that depended on having advanced foot soldiers, as it were, trying to reconnoiter the frontiers of reason and knowledge and information and the construction of the world. And yeah, it was going to be really undisciplined and unorganized and full of lots of false theories. But that's the price we have to pay to be in the business of isolating and finding truths in a systematic way.
Welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Manuel Vargas. He is Professor of Philosophy at UC San Diego, and his work has focused on moral psychology, free will, agency, Latin American philosophy, and more. His book is Building Better Beings, A Theory of Moral Responsibility, and he's also contributed to 4 Views on Free Will and been an editor for multiple volumes. And additionally, has a variety of published articles and book chapters. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Vargas.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about some of this kind of stuff that we're going to talk about today. So let's get started.
Awesome. So yeah, a bunch of stuff I want to cover, a lot of stuff related to free will and morality and moral responsibility. I think we'll start on some of the stuff to do with free will. And a couple of your articles I read had to do with like scientific threats to the existence of free will. Normally, when I think about scientific threats, I'm thinking of things like the Libet experiments, the Benjamin Libet, or however you pronounce his name, and stuff like that. Now, one thing that you note is that it's not necessarily that science is a threat to dualism or certain theories of mind, but that it's perhaps a threat to certain things that are taken to be requirements for freedom, that you're perhaps the ultimate source of your action or something else like that. And, well, the scientific evidence seems to suggest that there's precursors that are playing a role in the outcomes of your actions, or maybe a determining role. I don't know. So maybe if you want to talk more about that and where you think maybe there's some ways to push back against that sort of concern to free will.
Yeah. So I guess maybe the first thing I'll say out of the gate about this is that I'm skeptical that there's a single threat to free will that comes out of the sciences. I think that they're just different kinds of worries that people have. Sometimes they run them together. Sometimes they're more careful about keeping them apart from one another. But for example, here's a kind of just off the top of my head, some of the kinds of things that I know folks have worried about. So some people think that something about the sciences, whether as something that's been shown in the sciences or as a kind of background explanatory presumption, is determinism. So that speaks to the classic conceptions of what the free will problem is as a threat from determinism. Other folks have thought that maybe the real threat is something like the idea of causal embedding. So just quite apart from whether or not it's determinism, just the mere fact that we've got causal antecedents to what we do and then what we end up doing and then the causal results from that. I think some people have worried that alone is enough to get worries about free will going. I think there are other folks who worry about things like emergence and reduction, where the idea is the worry is that the explanation for how and why we do, maybe it's not, the problem isn't just that we're caused, but that really the causes are happening at the level of atoms banging around each other. And so there's nothing left over for things like intention formation to do, that these things are just as epiphenomenal or along for the ride. So this is just to kind of gesture at a couple of different ways in which people have thought findings in the science in one way, shape, or form create problems. And then, of course, there can be specific findings like things like the Libet experiment and some of its successors that purport to identify phenomena in the brain before subjects will report conscious awareness of having made a decision, and then that phenomena that precedes decisions. The question is, what is it? And so for folks who think that the Libet experiment shows something deep about human agency or about the absence of free will, interpret that finding as having located a decision before the decider is aware of it, sometimes how it's put, or that the brain makes a decision before the person realizes what it is. That's of course been contested, and I think maybe this is a little too strong the way I'm going to put it, but I think these days most neuroscientists who've spent serious amounts of time trying to get a grip on the philosophical dimensions of the free will problem at this point accept that the Libet experiment doesn't show what Libet thought it showed. And that is that identifying that there's brain phenomena happening before somebody's aware of making a decision doesn't yet show that they had made a decision. Whether it's drives, whether or not it's an impulse, whether or not it is consideration of a possibility, that thing that was getting called the RP that Libet identified, the readiness potential. There's just disagreement about how to think about what that is, and so it's not clear. It gets us to the no free will view, but those are some of the kinds of things I think about under the wider rubric of empirical challenges or broadly scientific challenges to free will.
Yeah, that's very good. One response I've seen to the inferences drawn from Libet experiments is that, look, at best, maybe this shows that some of our relatively simple decisions, like whether to press a button or something, may not be free, maybe, or may be determined in this way. But that doesn't necessarily show that all of our decisions, especially more complex ones that involve significant deliberation and so on, suffer the same result. I mean, this is even independent of maybe more philosophical or potentially linguistic questions about, does that actually undermine freedom in the first place, even in that more simple case? But yeah,
good. Yeah. So one way that some philosophers of action have sometimes talked about this is to make a distinction between what's sometimes called picking and choosing. So the idea is picking might be a case where you have to select amongst a set of options, but there's no particular reason in favor of one of the options versus any other. So you go to the grocery store, you've got to buy a box of cereal. You've got 18 boxes of cereal that are identical in every way that matters to your choice making in front of you. You just pick one. There's no reason to favor one over the other. Choosing, though, looks like a case where there might be reasons to be careful about what it is that we're selecting. And so I think some people have thought that picking cases are bad models for what it is that we want out of free will, and that better cases are the choosing cases where you have to decide, look, do you want a cheaper to purchase and a cheaper to drive gas-powered SUV, or do you want the more expensive to acquire and more expensive to buy the infrastructure for an electric car? Now you've got to make a choice. There's something that hinges on the choice. The various considerations that cut in favor of it might have kind of broadly potentially some moral or political significance, but certainly significance for your pocketbook and the other things you might care about. That looks like that's not a picking choice. That's a choosing choice. And so put that way, I think the choosing cases look like better candidates for what it is that we're interested in when we're having fights about free will and moral responsibility. And I think that's some reason why a number of both philosophers and neuroscientists have gone the route you were gesturing at. That is, thinking even if the Libet model shows us something, it's not clear it shows us anything about the kind of paradigmatic case that we were worried about.
Right. And then the other thing was that, like, for someone who's more of a compatibilist, they might say, yeah, this doesn't show that there's no free will. It just shows perhaps that these are some of the precursors to our choosings. That doesn't undermine necessarily that it was a free choice. And so the conclusion that it does so undermine free will rests on that assumption that, like, if there's these sort of precursors to our choosings, then they're not free in the relevant sense.
That's right. Yeah, I think this is a point that Al Mealy, in some of his work, has done a really nice job of making explicit. That there can be all sorts of things that would be antecedent to a choice, or to a bit of behavior that we wouldn't regard as particularly problematic. I mean, if anything, the mysterious and amazing thing would be if it turned out there were no causal antecedents to a decision. But that there, that if you're thinking about, wondering, is this the moment I should do it? Or you're thinking to yourself, is this impulse to do it enough of an impulse that I should now flex my wrist the way that the Libet experiment suggests? These things aren't decisions. Or in one of my favorite examples from Al Mealy's work, he talks about the difference between having the belief that your car is about to crash into a brick wall and having the intention or deciding to crash your car into a brick wall. This is a very important distinction for lots and lots of purposes. But it's also to point at, look, these are just different kinds of mental states, different kinds of phenomena between intending, believing, and desiring. And I think nothing in the Libet experiment gives us the tools to distinguish which of these things it is that's going on in the RP case. The second thing I'll note here about this is Uri Mao's neuroscientist at Chapman University. He, with some of his collaborators, has argued on the basis of kind of looking at the neuroscientific evidence that part of what's going on in these Libet cases is that the phenomena looks like it doesn't show up in the choosing kinds of cases. The RP just doesn't show up in the choosing cases, and it looks like it's more of an artifact of the picking cases. And or some people have thought, kind of relatedly, that maybe this is just a kind of artifact of statistical noise or neurological noise, rather than a real kind of discrete, clear neurological phenomena. So I think for a lot of these reasons, a lot of the Libet stuff has left. Certainly left a lot of the philosophers who think about this kind of unimpressed that there's that the findings show a real threat to the kinds of issues that philosophers take the free will debate to be about. And I think like I said earlier, I think it's probably true that a lot of the working neuroscientists now, who, at least those who have engaged with the philosophical concerns and have come to recognize, these things are more complicated than the Libet experiment maybe initially suggested.
Yeah, I wonder if a more serious potential challenge might be something if we find, and I think this has sometimes been claimed, that at least some of our intentions, or like the conscious aspect of our choosing, is potentially like epiphenomenal. Maybe it's not actually playing a role in the resulting action, like it's not part of the causal sequence at all. It's sort of bypassed by the other stuff going on. That might be a challenge even to most like compatibilists. What do you think about that as a concern?
So I'm unsure how serious the threat from epiphenomenalism is, and I say this for a couple of different reasons. So I think it could well turn out that much of our mental life, and in particular the mental life we take to be implicated in action production, so intentions and decisions and beliefs and desires and so on, it could well turn out that that's epiphenomenal and has no direct causal influence on anything we do. Now, I mean, I think there's a sense in which that kind of claim, on the one hand, it looks like a straightforwardly empirical question. Do we find that there's actually causal influence there? But I think it's slightly misleading because part of the issue is, what the heck do we mean by causation, and what is it that counts as causation? And so I think that there's some reason to think that a satisfactory notion of causation is going to have to allow that causation happens, and real genuine causation happens, even at relatively, for lack of a better way of putting it, at relatively high level, complex, multicellular phenomena. And if that's so, then I think it wouldn't be particularly surprising to turn out that our intentions, beliefs, and desires actually cause things in some interesting and meaningful way. And in fact, it might be surprising if it turned out that it didn't. And so I think there are a bunch of um, live empirical and frankly philosophical questions about how to think about the nature of agency and its place in nature that make it unclear how seriously we should take the threat from epiphenomenalism. So that's the first pass at it. But the second pass at it is, I do think, as you were earlier gesturing towards, there is an interesting question about how to understand one if one is inclined towards a broadly compatibilist theory of free will. And here, by compatibilist, I just mean a theory of free will that holds that we could have free will even if determinism is true. What would whether or not epiphenomenalism is a threat is partly going to depend on the particular commitments of the compatibilist theory. So, one way to think about the contrast cases here is I think it's probably a threat to everyday ordinary understandings about what free will is. But as I've argued in a number of different contexts, I think it's a complicated question what the relationship is between our everyday understandings of things and what the right theoretical understanding is. And so I think it might turn out for free will that it's a bit like simultaneity in physics, where the right theoretical understanding of what simultaneity comes to ends up being at a significant remove from what everyday full convictions about simultaneity come to. And so if it turns out free will is a bit like that, then it might turn out that even if epiphenomenalism were true, it might impinge greatly on everyday understandings of free will. But you could imagine a theoretical construct of free will for which it wouldn't turn out to matter. And I think we have some. So think about Harry Frankfurt's Freedom of the Will and the Concept of a Person, this 1971 paper, where he argues for a picture of free will that is grounded in roughly having identifying with the involved motives. And so you can imagine a version of that kind of view that says, look, we're indifferent about what, it doesn't matter for free will whether or not those motives were the things that actually produced the action. So I think on Frankfurt's version, there is a kind of a presumption that that there's an effective first order desire that moves you to act. But you could imagine rewriting that account in a way where it's the test of freedom is whether or not you endorse the action and you endorse the principle on which you took yourself to move to act. And so put that way, it looks like epiphenomenalism, could be compatible with a lightly reconstructed version of the Frankfurtian story. And similarly, I think we might be able to do a similar kind of thing with certain kinds of reasons responsiveness views, where the test for freedom is whether or not you were suitably recognizing and responding to reasons. And you might think something like, even if the recognition of response isn't happening at the high level, mentalistic level, if it turns out the system is behaving in that way, even on account of lower level phenomena, that might be okay too. And so again, I think that partly just depends on how much we think our theories of freedom and responsibility need to be beholden to the kinds of everyday commitments that show up when we first start thinking and talking about the free will problem.
Yeah, very good. And just another thing on compatibilism, I like in my experience, and this happens, I think it sometimes in the literature as well. Incompatibilists, free will skeptics, they sometimes dismiss compatibilism as, in your words, like a definitional gambit, or maybe changing the question or subject. What do you think about that charge? Is that just making a claim about how the language is normally used and saying the compatibilists are using it differently, or maybe it's an empirical dispute at that point, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, so a couple of different thoughts about this. So at a first pass, I think sometimes when it feels like you've got a philosophical issue where there are relatively clear and distinct camps that both regard the other position as, in some sense, deeply confused or fun, or even baffling why anybody would hold it, or accusing the other side of arguing in bad faith. I tend to think that that's at least some evidence to think that part of what's going on is a debate in a different place. And in this particular case, I think that one of the hidden fault lines in debates about free will are different conceptions of what it is that philosophers ought to be doing, or what it is that we should understand our task to be. So I think there are some folks, and there's a kind of fine tradition of this. I mean, for examples of this, you think about 20th century analytic metaphysics in the sort of P.F. Strawson style descriptive metaphysics mode, where the job of philosophers is to articulate the kinds of categories that we have and use and understand the world in, and to describe that. And that's the task of the descriptive metaphysician. And it's explicitly for Strawson opposed to the idea of a revisionist metaphysics. So the idea that philosophers could be recommending conceptual or commitment changes or changes in meaning is just off the table for philosophers who accept as a background commitment that the business that we're supposed to be in is descriptive metaphysics. Similarly, for folks who are doing ordinary language philosophy, the idea is we're supposed to be understanding the kinds of hidden commitments in our language, and that this reflects a kind of sophistication over time and tracking distinctions that matter to us. Again, there it looks like there's a kind of a skepticism about broadly, about philosophical theories that depart from, as it were, everyday common sense or everyday language, or the Nozick philosophical explanations model, where what we're supposed to be doing when we're doing philosophy is we're providing explanations of how it could be the case that, and then insert thing that we care about, how it could be the case that it operates in roughly the ways in which we think. And those sorts of pictures, I think, are broadly at odds with a very different strand of doing philosophy, according to which, and here I think of this as the kind of broadly Quinean naturalist strand, where doing philosophy is going to be continuous with the broadly the scientific enterprise, and that one consequence of this is that our view of how we come to think of it ourselves may well be subject to revision and change, and there's a wing of theorizing that sort of grows out of this, thinking about like Goodman and Rawls and reflective equilibrium, where the thought is, so if we're doing normative ethics, I think almost no one thinks we're going to get a theory of normative ethics that tightly and neatly corresponds to our pre-philosophical intuitions. And so something's got to give. And then we need principles about which ones we hold on to and not. So I think part of what's gone on in the free will problem, and this is a very long answer to a very short question, but I think part of what's gone on in the free will problem is that that philosophers are approaching it with wildly different metaphilosophical views about what to do and how to do it. And so you end up with people making accusations that the other side is cheating at addressing the problem as they conceive of it, when the other side just doesn't share a conception of what the problem is, what the tools are that are proper to responding to it, and how it is that we'd go about addressing it. And so I think, to jump back to this, the objection about the wretched subterfuge, I think, well, there are compatibilists and then there are compatibilists. There are compatibilists with very different kinds of metaphilosophical views that are trying to do different things. So I think if we think back to in the 1950s and 60s, the enterprise that some compatibilists had with the conditional analysis of Kant, where the assertion was, look, this is what we mean, and this is all we mean when we talk about Kant, and the kind of powers that the libertarians or incompatibilists broadly construed were attributing to people. I think those folks thought it was just a wild misdescription of our everyday usage of Kant. And I think for their part, a lot of incompatibilists at that time thought, no, this is another instance of the wretched subterfuge. This is like, it's clear that although we might sometimes want to talk in those ways, that we have another, as they put it, categorical notion of Kant that is way more demanding. And so then this is where that objection gets going. But I think on the flip side, you have other folks for whom the thought goes something like, look, I'm not trying to tell you what our ordinary convictions are. What I'm trying to tell you is what all things considered we ought to think, in the same way in which physicists don't take themselves to be providing theories that are just consistent with what pre-scientific or pre-theoretical work produces. And that it would just be a mistake to think that what scientific physics should look like is something that neatly corresponds with our pre-theoretical commitments. And I think so. There's some folks who, and I think of myself as amongst them, who are inclined to think, well, no, theorizing may sometimes take us at some remove. And so, however wretched my account is, it's not a subterfuge, because I think I'm upfront that this is intended as a proposal for how we ought to go forward regimenting the ways in which we talk, given where we find ourselves and our theoretical commitments.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I'm gonna come next to some stuff about that'll be related to that. But I just want to say my general approach on this is pretty similar to Mark Balaguer's approach, if you're familiar, which is to say, I want to get clearer on the question. Maybe that involves doing some conceptual analysis. What exactly are we committing to when we say or deny that we have free will? And that might end up showing that the incompatibilists and the compatibilists really aren't saying the same things. They have different things in mind. I like personally, upon reflection and just assessment of how I tend to use the terms, I'm a compatibilist. I use the terms in a compatibilist way. I'm not making any assumption about, whether the correct theory of the physical laws are deterministic or indeterministic or something about causation. I have all sorts of concerns about causation anyway, that about what that exactly is. That just doesn't enter into my like metaphysical commitments when I use those terms at all. Whether that's a general feature of people's commitments when they use the vocabulary, that's an empirical question. But for me, is what I would want to do is let's get clear on the usage that we have in mind when we're asking these questions and answer it on that usage, and we can do that on other usages as well, if that makes sense. So maybe we do have human-style freedom, but not libertarian. Who knows?
Yeah. So in some moods, I'm very sympathetic to this line. In other moods, though, I guess I'm not entirely sold on it. So I think you can imagine. Well, so maybe here's one way to put it: is that that we can have varied theoretical interests in a domain. So one of the things we could do is we could think, what I want the best account of how it is that people, in fact, use a bit of terminology. Like, how does that terminology function? And I just want to be able to pick out an account that gets the functioning of that terminology right. Other folks might think, well, look, I'm not really interested in an account about how that term functions in terms of, as it were, everyday discourse. What I want to know is, what is the thing that is being referred to when people talk in those ways? Because it could turn out that there's a kind of fractured reference case where it might turn out there's actually not just one thing they're talking about. They're talking about multiple things. So it's a jadeite and ephrite kind of situation where we use one word jade and it's actually picking out two very discrete kinds of things in the world. And so there might be people who are interested in what the referent is of that way of talking, even if we had a completely good story about, like, here are all the contexts in which people use the word jade. It might turn out that there are different discrete phenomena that we want a theory about. Then there might be people who also could think, well, look, I'm not really particularly or exclusively interested in the question of what are the ways in which we tend to talk about the color jade? Or do we use it just as a color? Do we use it as a mineral? Do we use it for both of these things? If it is a mineral, which mineral is it? There might be somebody who says, what I want to do is I want to capture or explain whether or not we should talk about and have thought and talk about jade in a specific kind of way going forward, given everything that we have reason to think about jade. So maybe it'll turn out that once we've done the jade discourse and we go and investigate the nature of the jade world, it turns out actually we're not just referring to two things, we're referring to 50 different things, that it doesn't hang together. It's a monstrous category. Or maybe maybe the ways in which we talk and think and regiment these things, it just turns out to be like phlogiston or like witches or like, any number of examples where it just feels like maybe we should purge this vocabulary. So that's the sense in which I would want to be cautious about this, because I think a lot of philosophy is deeply personal. We're motivated by a particular version of a puzzle that is the puzzle that we're interested in. But I think there are a lot of different kinds of and sometimes overlapping questions relating to phenomena that span, how do we talk about it? What is it that we're thinking when we're thinking about it? What kinds of objects does it pick out in the world? What's our best all things considered account of how we should continue to go forward using this bit of language or not? And each of those questions seem to me good questions, interesting questions, questions that merit answers, but it might be that these answers diverge in different places, or that if you're just looking at one of those components and not the other, that you would end up with a very different kind of theory.
Yeah, I think I agree with most of that. So what I was suggesting is like one thing, and I'm fine with also having this question of, okay, what is the right way or the best way or the practical way to continue talking, or so for example, we might say, suppose we uh, kind of make the free will question into two distinct questions. Maybe there's two different conventions regarding how those terms are used, and we answer the question on each of them. The question might then be, okay, but how are we going to use these terms going forward? Or what sort of considerations in favor of one or the other? That seems to me a separate question, though. Does that make sense to you, or would you still push back on that?
So I think there are questions and there are questions. So there are different ways we can carve out what counts as the question, right? So if the global question is what's the best account of free will, then you might think we're trading on ambiguity about what we mean by best or best theory or something like that. But I do think there might be some sense in which you could imagine saying something like, all things considered, what ought we to think about free will? And then it might turn out that can decompose into multiple kinds of questions. But bracketing the question of the individuation of questions, we're getting very metaphilosophical here. It does seem to me totally reasonable to say, well, let's treat as discrete kinds of questions. The question about, like, how is it that we use these terms? What is it that we have in mind when we use these terms? And those kinds of questions might be different from questions about how, all things considered, ought we to go forward in our discourse and practice of this kind of thing. So I think it's reasonable to start with the presumption that those things come apart. But I actually think that there are going to be cases where these things end up, where there's some reason to think that they collapse into one another in special kinds of cases. And I think the special kinds of cases that present challenges for thinking maybe there's a privileged direction of collapse precisely have to do with things that are normative notions. And so this gets to one of the other, I think, real fault lines in the free will literature is, do we think of free will as a term or as a concept or as a thing that can be, as it were, independently specified, as it were, maybe from the armchair by thinking about its extensional, its extensional shape or whatever. The kind of armchair, think of it as broadly the armchair metaphysics approach. And then, on the other side, there might be this real question, I think, of whether or not we can, or whether or not we have a kind of power, ability, or capacity that is of a sort that would license attributions of praise and blame. And as you know, big chunks of the literature tend to think and talk about free will in a way that is that hitches it to these normative questions. And so if you think of free will as a kind of status within a normative practice, then there might be pressure to think that some of the questions about how ought we to go forward using this are actually determinative about what the nature of the thing is and what it's and what how we ought to think about it, in the same way in which you might think, look, there's a question about how you and I talk about justice or the good or what's immoral, but like our local usages don't settle the question of what those things really come to and what those things mean. And the normative prescriptive theory might be our best bet for actually understanding what those phenomena turn out to be.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask about this next, right? Because that's correct. It's often alleged that free will is sort of interdefined with moral responsibility. Sort of, it's something you need to it's a capacity you need to have to one capacity anyway to count as morally responsible for some action. But to me, that's like, if that might be a way to make progress if one, that's how people are generally thinking about free will, and two, by moral responsibility we have roughly the same thing in mind, right? Like we mean roughly the same thing by that term. So I'm going to want to go down that line there, and I'm kind of pessimistic about that.
About
That
which part?
the second part, that we do have roughly the same thing in mind when we're talking about moral responsibility, um, uh, especially among philosophers, but also among just the general populace using that term. I mean, maybe there's some reason to be concerned about the first part too, that normal usage of the terms like free will do build in things to do with like moral responsibility. But regardless of that, my concern was with the second part.
So can you tell me a little bit about your concern about that second part?
Well, I think when people, especially philosophers writing on this, are thinking about moral responsibility, there's just, in many cases, just wildly different things they might have in mind. Or, like for me, and I've had a few guests on somewhat recently who have talked about some of this stuff. Um, uh, Certain ways, certain realist commitments, that there are these stance independent norms that determine the responsibility facts. I can't even make sense of that, right? So I don't even know what's being said, and but that's not the only thing that people might have in mind. They might have certain instrumentalists. We'll turn to some of your stuff related to that, and or otherwise subjectivist or whatever other things they might have in mind that I can make sense of, but are radically divergent from other approaches. And I'm, well, maybe this is a potential dispute. Are these differences a difference in their like claims about these things, or differences in just what they have in mind when they're using the terms, right? Is it a substantive dispute or just something more semantic, maybe? Um, and I'm worried that it's something more semantic in these cases, but I don't know.
Yeah, good. So I think there are very sensible and reasonable worries in this neighborhood. I think that that we can address and overcome some of the worries, but I'm not sure that we can address and overcome all of the worries, because I do think that there are real substantive disagreements lurking in this neighborhood, uh, and that some ways of trying to kind of designate what part of the debate, as it were, that one is interested in is going to come at the cost of failing to address or capture some of the complexities, or maybe even generate further downstream complexities on how to think about this set of issues about what's conceptual, what's semantic, what has to do with the referred property or the property that we're referring to when we have discourse about these things. But all of that, again, I think is really points to the fact of, and I do think it's a fact of barely submerged but ubiquitous methodological disagreements about what it is that we're doing when we're doing philosophy, and what is it that we think counts as the problem and the shape of a good answer to the problem. So here's one thing I guess I would say by way of response. I think take two different methodological starting points for thinking about free will and moral responsibility. And here I'm just going to take on board. I think you're right to note that people can contest the linkage of these things, but let's accept a linkage here for the purposes of our discussion. So take two different ways you might approach this. So one way we could do this is by sitting around thinking that about our kind of central conceptual commitments about this. When I think about free will, what is it that I have in mind? And then I might try to articulate a theory that captures the kinds of cases I tend to think and talk about, that captures the kinds of sometimes at least the pre-philosophically inchoate, but that are then philosophically refined kinds of cases. So then I articulate a theory, right? So call that a kind of concept first approach. And so there, then what happens is, once you have your concept, you can go out into the world, and we can argue about what's in the concept or not, and we can argue whether or not there's anything out in the world that corresponds to it. I think there's a big cluster of philosophers who think about these things, who approach it in that kind of concept first way. Here's a different way we could think about it. A different way we could think about this is we could look around at a bunch of our everyday practices, point to those things. And so what everyday practices? Well, here, point to our differential praising and blaming of one another, and our moralized praising and blaming of one another, where we say things like, that was really terrible. Why'd you do that? Or that's your fault. Or, where we demand an explanation for why it is that somebody did something that we think of as antisocial or counternormative. And then we can ask ourselves, okay, so take that collection of practices over which we have these differential moralized praising and blaming, and then ask of those practices, is there or are there structures of agency or capacities or abilities, the possession of which would justify or make sense of these normative practices? Now, notice this is what I think of as a kind of phenomena first or practice first picture, where the thought is we point to stuff in the universe and we say, okay, now we want to know whether or not those things are in good standing. Are we justified in continuing to think and talk in those ways? And so there it looks like the phenomena we're pointing to is relatively uncontroversial. And you might think we have widespread agreement about the kinds of things that are roughly responsibility practices. And there might be disagreement about whether or not the best account of that phenomena is realist or non-realist, or whether or not it is to be understood as in instrumental terms or in terms that make desert first and foremost. Those are real substantive theoretical debates about how to regiment the phenomena, but there's agreement about the phenomena. And I guess I'm inclined to think there is some reason for optimism that we have actually pretty good agreement about the phenomena around which we're theorizing. And that's that by and large, most of the time, most of the cases, we tend to agree, yeah, that's a case of responsibility. But you don't see people in the literature spending a lot of time saying, no, the central case that you're arguing for your theory on, that's not really a case of responsibility. And often there's even a fair amount of convergence about whether or not we should think of these cases as responsible or not, and to what degree, and so on. So amongst theorists, there's a lot of that convergence. Not 100%. Generate Frankfurt cases, and then the fights are off to the races about whether or not those are going to be. We get convergence on those cases, but I think we get a lot of the convergence. Okay, so then this last thought is just that then where the substantive disagreements really are is at the matter of what's the best. And this is going to make it sound contentious, but I guess I'm okay with this degree of contentiousness. What's the best bit of normative and metaphysical bookkeeping for the practices that we find? And some people are going to think the best version of it is anti-realist, and some people are going to think the best version of it is realist. And those are important disagreements, but they're not disagreements about what the phenomena is. And so I think we can agree about the phenomena, but shouldn't let the fact of real and robust disagreement about how to do the bookkeeping of that phenomena count as a reason for worrying that we don't have convergence around what it is that we're trying to be giving a theory about.
Yeah, but so is the phenomenon in this case just various behaviors, practices, utterances, maybe? I mean, is that the phenomenon?
Judgments, emotional reactions. This is all the phenomena. So, think of it as, a cluster of beliefs about people being at fault, a cluster of reactions that include all the stuff that P.F. Strawson talked about, these reactive attitudes, the gratitude, resentment, indignation, so on. And then various practices that express these things, or that attempt to as it were, express and show our commitments to the norms entwined with these kinds of reactions to the conduct of other people, or to ourselves even.
Right. So I guess that's fine. I mean, I would just wonder. The thing that I want to hone in on is the beliefs and judgments there about fault and other things, other normative things. Like, I would want to try to understand what the sort of content of those beliefs are. What exactly are people believing when they say they believe that someone's at fault? Um,
Good. So I think that isn't that. I mean,
yeah.
that's a good question, and it's at least an empirical question in the sense of, it looks like the kind of thing that in principle we could go out and try to get some grip on. Now, again, notice though that that for lots of theorists in this domain, even if we had a complete account of everything that anybody ever explicitly thought when they made judgments about fault, it might not yet follow that we have an account about free will or about moral responsibility, in the same way in which if we did a rich taxonomy of all of the judgments that people ever made about motion, that it would give us the right account about physical motion. So it could just turn out that we've got slightly screwy beliefs about how some bit of the world works, and that's the sense in which I think there are these difficult and interesting questions about what all things considered ought we to believe, especially for normative notions that put pressure on the thought that we could just have, difficult to escape but nevertheless imperfectly reliable normative commitments.
Right. Oh, so my thought here is not necessarily that by figuring out what people have in mind or what they're committing to, we're going to figure everything there is to figure out about, say, blame or responsibility or fault, but that we could at least have enough to fix the referent or like figure out what people are talking about, even if they get a lot of the details wrong about that thing. So we might still be revisionist in a way, but we're still figuring out what it is they're talking about. We have enough to well, try to figure out if they're right or if the thing exists or something like that. My point is just getting clear on what exactly they're asserting.
Yeah, good. I mean, I do think there are these interesting challenge points for thinking about things in this way. I mean, as you know, I am sympathetic to one way of putting this project. I mean, that is, I think, there is an interesting question about like what is it that people believe, and then and you might think there could be a gap between the things that people believe and what those beliefs commit them to, right? So it might turn out that people don't have super complicated beliefs. They just think, I don't think determinism is true. And yeah, I think that somebody has to be the cause of what they did. And then it turns out that the only way that you can unpack, and here I'm not going to argue for this, and I'm not sure that I think it's true, but you can imagine people thinking, yeah, but what that actually commits them to is something like agent causation, or it turns out that the best regimentation or way to render true all of the beliefs they have requires a very demanding metaphysics that might never cross their mind. So I think I'd want to be careful here about trying to draw a distinction between the contents of the beliefs and what people take themselves to be asserting, and what actually follows from the collection of assertions, or what is the best way to make sense of that collection of assertions. So I think there's that set of issues. But then I think there can be cases where you have where it might be plausible to think that for a wide range of important and explanatory purposes, that what people take themselves to be talking about might not be a reliable guide to the phenomena itself. And so, here's an example of it. Suppose we go back to, 12th century Europe, and we're all good Roman Catholics. And so you and I are talking about the nature of marriage, and when we agree, because we're good Catholics, that marriage is a sacramental relation between a man and a woman. And so then when we ask whether or not somebody is married to somebody else, you and I might agree that like part of what we're checking on is whether or not there is a sacramental relation that holds between a man and a woman. Now, if somebody were to come along and a 21st century ethnographer parachutes in on, I don't know why this time machine has a parachute, but parachutes in and now joins us in our conversation. We're outside of Bruges, let's say. The smell of chocolate is in the air. Wait, actually, wouldn't have been in the air yet because they didn't have the conquest of the Americas to get access to chocolate yet. Okay, so there's no chocolate in the air. It's beer that we're smelling in the air. So we're having this conversation, and the ethnographer parachutes in and says, okay, I want to tell you guys about societies in which people live together in legally recognized intimate relationships with one another that me and my community call and recognize as marriages, but they have never heard of the Catholic Church. They don't know what sacraments are and could never imagine that there are sacraments. Do you guys think that they're married? Now, you might imagine you and I at that point, we might have a really rich disagreement amongst ourselves, right? Where you're going to lean into saying, well, look, if they don't have the sacraments and it's not been sacramentally recognized, then they don't have marriage. Whatever they're doing, it's a complicated version of living in sin, but it's not marriage. And then I might think, well, I'd never really thought about it before, but maybe the sacramental part, maybe that's just a Catholic species of marriage. Maybe it's not what really marriage is. And then you say, how could you think that? You're just being a bad Catholic. And then I say, well, like I accept that for us, that's how marriage has to operate, but maybe it's a species of a wider kind of practice for which some versions of the practice lack that element. And so I think, that might point to a case where even if you have tremendous convergence in a community about a notion, it might turn out that that's a local regimentation. And then notice, if you're a 21st century atheist, what you might say about those 12th century Catholics is you could think, not only is it not essential, it turns out that if you thought that was essential, then you'd be facing a real problem if it turned out you became convinced that God didn't exist and there weren't sacraments and so on. And then it looks like, then the 12th century Catholic who's insisting that no, unless it's sacramental, it's not marriage, is now faced with saying that if they were to become atheists, that like, holy cow, nobody was ever really married. And that looks like a wild outcome. And so I think the only way to avoid that is to just accept that there can be cases where there might be conceptual and linguistic pressures that should make us cautious about wanting to think that the contents of our beliefs and the consequences of the commitments that flow from making sense of the content of those beliefs settles reference for a term.
Yeah. So then the question is whether that feature is like part of the reference fixing or just something someone might believe about the thing, but it's not part of the reference fixing. And maybe there's a lot of vagueness there in the middle. There might be some controversial questions about language lurking around here. But my thought would be that in the case of whatever we're considering, like fault or marriage or whatever, there's, in principle, we could figure it out, whether someone is thinking about that feature as like essential to the thing they have in mind, or if it's just a claim they're making about the thing. And I mean, that might be tricky in some cases, and it might be unclear, but I mean, that's what I would try to do, if that makes sense.
Well, I think sometimes we can do that, but I'm not sure that we can every time. And part of the reason why I say this is, I mean, so there's some folks who do philosophy in this mode. One of my teachers from graduate school, John Perry, used to sometimes say this, that anytime somebody starts talking about something being essential in philosophy, the argument's gone wrong. And so in some moods, I think you can imagine packages of philosophical commitments that are really skeptical about the ambition to show or provide essential properties for anything, whether it's essential components of a concept or essential properties for being that kind of thing. And part of the kind of or one way you might come to have a vision about that sort of thing is you might just think, look, we've got information we're keeping track of, we've got properties we're keeping track of in the world. Which cluster, which of those properties or which of those pieces of information end up being essential for our categories or bookkeeping that we do of those things. That might shift around depending on who's asking and what the ambition is in asking that question. And so, in some sense, I think this pushes in the direction of the kinds of things that folks who have been doing some work in conceptual engineering have been right to caution us to think carefully about like what constitutes topic continuity. And so, as David Plunkett has noted, I mean, there might be a variety of different ways that we could think that something counts as the same topic, but it might not always be in virtue of the same set of concerns or interests. Because as our interests shift around, maybe it's going to pick out different kinds of standards for what counts as topic continuity. And put that way, then you might start to wonder whether or not we're going to get a good story about, like, this is essential to the concept. And instead, what you might get is something like, well, this is more central to these ways of thinking about X, Y, and Z, rather, but maybe less central if what we're really interested in is A, B, and C.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, yeah, I I do think it gets or can get quite messy. Like, it's easy to think of a lot of like paradigmatic examples, like, oh, it's just essential to our notion of a triangle that it has three sides, and then thinking like that maybe all of our term usage or concepts work in that way. Like, there's all the features that are essential in that way, and then there's all the ones that we might attribute to them but aren't um, like definitional uh, in that way. But it's might be more vague and messy and fluid and changing in the ways that you were just talking about. Is that maybe a way to put it?
Yeah, I think it's a really nice way to put it. And I think, one way to maybe think about this is you could have the view that there's something special about math and geometry, where the definitional, the kind of identification of essential properties in virtue of definitional interests, um, doesn't go live in when we move over to lots of the natural and maybe especially the social world. So, one way to see that is just to think about kind of relatively concrete cases. So I ask you, is it essential to a touchdown that it be worth 6 points? And then we can have this conversational go different ways, right? So you say no, not really, and then I'm like, oh, so tell me about the touchdowns that weren't worth 6 points. um, and then if we're sufficiently historically informed, one of us will pull out the fact that at one point touchdowns weren't worth 6 points, or that they could be changed by the NFL rules committee if they wanted to, 3 years from now. And so by the time we start doing this and telling the story, then it looks like, even certain kinds of definitional strategies look really messy when we get to the social sphere, where it turns out, we can define social roles, but then change our minds about them and think that they are subject to different kinds of pressures that shift around as our ambitions and forms of social organization change.
Yeah, very good. I mean, I was thinking about that touchdown case. It's like, well, is our notion of, or how we're using the word touchdown, flexible enough to, so that, say, if the um, NFL made it such that a touchdown was worth 5 points, quote unquote touchdown was worth 5 points, would that still count as a touchdown, or would it be a different sort of thing? I think probably it would count as a touchdown. I mean, I think our notion is probably flexible enough, but maybe some people would disagree, um, or maybe for them it really isn't so flexible. Uh, you know,
And it might matter
maybe in
too.
some cases it's not so clear. We haven't even, yeah.
Yeah, good. I mean, it might matter too who was doing the rule change. So if you and I got together a team of flag football, we get a bunch of our philosophy friends together, and we're going to do have a philosophy flag football game. You can imagine that the group of us could agree that we were going to play by a certain set of rules, but then somebody in a fit of perversity announces, "Hey, I've got an idea. Let's make touchdowns worth 9 points for this game." and we could get widespread agreement on it, and we could agree that we're going to call it, and we could have everybody who's involved in this game agree. But you can imagine people afterwards wanting to discuss and argue about whether or not other people should recognize that the touchdown was worth 9 points, and what was the real score of the game, or like, does this speak to the wider practice? And so you might think this is part of what's interesting about certain kinds of forms of social organization, where we create mechanisms for authority endowment to help settle these kinds of questions. And so that's what the rules committee does, or that's what a legislature does, or a judiciary. That it's part of our kind of technology for resolving questions about social organization or social orientation. And you might think, where we lack those sorts of things, then it becomes an even messier business, right? Because we have no place to appeal to, and now we're left, some folks saying, no, we should extend our notion of marriage in this way, and other folks saying, no, we shouldn't extend it in that way because that would have these kinds of consequences, and so on, and then we're off to the races of as my teacher Ken Taylor used to put it, the messy retail business of politics.
Yeah, I think that these are some really fascinating issues, and I could explore this much longer, but there's some other things I want to cover here. So, yeah. So in a couple of your papers and elsewhere, you were discussing a few different distinctions. Like there's eliminativism, there's revisionism, and we've sort of been talking about these things, but not in these terms. And then maybe there's sort of discretionism. So eliminativism, roughly, is the view that in some domain, the target facts or phenomena are false or do not exist. Revisionism says that the target facts or phenomena exist or may exist, but there's like some widespread false beliefs about them. And then discretionism, roughly, is the view that there are distinct but legitimate reference conventions, and maybe on one it might make sense to be a eliminativist, and on the other a non-eliminativist, and so on. Is that roughly right? And maybe you would expand on that. I know you have some concerns about discretionism as a view, or maybe it's not offering very much, but
yeah. So I think that these are reasonable first pass characterizations of it. I mean, of course, as with everything in philosophy, we can induce additional degrees of fine grainedness in the characterization of it. But I think, as working notions, the eliminativist says it's not there, or we should stop using that vocabulary. The revisionist says we can hold on to that vocabulary, and or that thing is there, it's just not the way you thought it was. And the discretionist says, well, we've got different ways that we can talk about this, and we can either talk about it not being there or talk about it being there, and that's and we've got some discretion depending on context about which way of talking we go.
Yeah, right. So you're someone who might be a fictionalist, say, or thinks that they're eliminativist technically in the sense that they think that stuff doesn't exist, but thinks that it's for some reason or another fine to go on talking in that way. Maybe some people think that way about numbers, like certain abstract objects, maybe. Is that not a sort of eliminativism, or would you consider that just
yeah, so I think most versions of fictionalism are probably best understood as responses to the problems that get generated by eliminativist views. So so I think it's a species of eliminativism, or a downstream, as a downstream reaction to upstream eliminativism.
Yeah. So on the discretionism part, I don't know. I guess I was just taking discretionism as just a person making a kind of metalinguistic claim about how the relevant terms are being used. They're being used in different ways, potentially or allegedly talking about different things. And I mean, I think that's the case often, and we can explore those different uses and answer the questions on them. I mean, that's not going to answer a bunch of other questions we might have. Going back to what we were saying earlier about the like maybe how we should use the terms or um, other things in that normative sense. But it's still, I mean, a substantive claim about um, term use and so on. I don't know. Or do you think there's some concern remaining for this view?
Yeah. Um, Good. So discretionism is a kind of view that Sean Nichols is the kind of person in the free will literature who's most associated with this view. Um, and I think it's an interesting view. I think it does pick out a kind of possibility, and I think it's an interesting and distinctive possibility. I guess I'm unsold on whether or not, or one way to put it is how much that we should think that possibility is actual, and if we did think it was actual, how much we should think that it gets much traction on the kinds of issues that have been front and center in large swaths of the free will and moral responsibility literatures. So here's why I say that. So I guess I think we can acknowledge that it might well be the case that there are just these distinct reference conventions, and maybe there's a way to show that. But one of the things that's unclear, at least to me, is how we would distinguish a case in which there are these genuine reference conventions, each of which is as well rightly licensed as that reference convention could be. How we distinguish that from a case where there is a single correct reference convention, and then people are using it wrongly. And so that kind of case, it looks like it's not clear to me how we would distinguish it. Now, one thing you could end up saying is, well, there's a kind of difference in theoretical ambition here between a kind of broadly descriptivist and a broadly prescriptivist picture about language. And I do think, yeah, absolutely, this is a thing. It's a move that we could make in this domain. Is somebody could just report, look, people use this term in a bunch of different ways. Sometimes people talk about water as as H2O, and other times people talk about water, including all kinds of stuff being in addition to H2O, or maybe even lacking H2O altogether, right? So there might be cases under which we could make this as a kind of descriptive discovery about the ways in which people talk. And so I think fair enough. But it's not clear to me how, and then this gets to what's the upshot, even if that was the conclusion, what the upshot is for classical debates about free will. So that is, should we think that the kind of agency that underpins ascriptions of responsibility, should we think that we have that kind of agency or not? Do we think what's the minimum amount of metaphysical demandingness, as it were, or the thinnest notion of agency that would justify our treating each other in the ways in which we do? And I think noting that there is, as a kind of descriptive fact, distinct reference conventions doesn't help us answer those questions, which I take to be the central questions about the debate. And so if it turns out on some reference conventions we have free will and on some we don't, I still think that leaves untouched the question about can we justify ways of treating one another? And that looks like a very different kind of work than the identification of reference conventions.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And so on your view, which I think you mentioned in brief already, you have this kind of instrumentalist approach, right? I mean, we think that we're these kind of pro-social creatures, and certain practices of blaming and praising and various other reactive attitudes help to secure various social goods, and maybe they're instrumentally justified in that way. And so then we can ask maybe more pointed questions about what sort of features of us as agents, or what sort of agency might be involved in those practices, or I don't know how we might put it, but yeah, maybe do you want to expand on the instrumentalist view here and some of those details?
Yeah, sure. So here's how I tend to think about at least the kinds of theoretical stakes for theorizing about moral responsibility that have been of particular interest to me. So one of the kinds of questions I want to know an answer to is whether or not we're justified in treating people in these distinctively moralized ways in which we do. So I want to figure out, can I be justified in as pedestrian a thing as getting grouchy when my kids haven't taken out the trash or the recycling, and whether or not it is we're justified in condemning someone when they have their state institute or commit massive atrocities or something like that. So I think there's a kind of wide range of everyday, ordinary cases, and then super morally significant kinds of cases where this kind of question goes live. And then so my thought is, well, what would be the kind of the thinnest story we could tell about what would be required to do that? Because I think in some sense what I want is, or maybe the right way to think about this is, what are the minimally sufficient conditions that we would have to satisfy in order to be justified in doing that? Now, it might turn out that, of course, more demanding forms of agency would be sufficient to do it too, but I'm interested in what's the kind of relatively the thinnest version that we could get away with doing. And especially, this is partly back ends into some of the things that we've been talking about, against the background presumption that I'm inclined to think that there are genuinely strands of everyday ordinary convictions about things that are best understood as regimenting in a broadly incompatibilist direction. But I think that doesn't settle the question about what's what we're justified in doing to one another, and that requires this kind of enterprise about are we justified? So I think that's where I get going. And then, as you I think nicely described, the basic story that I pursue is instrumentalist in the following sense. So here's something that I think could conceivably justify practices like ours, is if our having these practices had the effect of building better beings. That over time, if they could come to foster, enhance, and extend our sensibility in ways that made us recognize and respond to what kinds of moral considerations there are, or if that's too robust for you, one can say the kinds of things that we locally regard as moral considerations. So I think that's the project, and then the question is, okay, so why and what would do that, and why and what would get us there? And I think, well, there is a kind of functionalist story we can tell about the origin of these kinds of things that you might think, as a matter of the origins, it might well be the case that it was something like we needed a kind of a norm enforcement system in order to get certain kinds of collective goods. And the moral responsibility system grew out of a kind of norm enforcement system amongst creatures like us. Now, the thing to think is that, and here is the additional layer I'll put on this, is I don't want to move from the thought of that's how it functioned when we got this stuff to that's how it has to function now. That is, we can acquire things because of a certain kind of causal historical story. But what gives us a reason to continue to do those things is if it turns out that our practice, or something very much like it, continues to produce goods that, or maybe it's discontinuously, right? So maybe we acquired goods that the system enabled later on that are valuable and important. And so I think that's in some sense what the building better beings story is about. That teleological story is a conjecture that that we can and do get those kinds of goods. And what makes it plausible is that having creatures that recognize and respond to moral considerations and incentivizing that we train ourselves up in those ways enables wide-scale cooperation and coordination goods that otherwise would be very difficult for us to have if we weren't creatures that were invested in trying to train ourselves up in those ways. So that's kind of roughly the basic approach.
Great. I was wondering what you think of even another potentially even thinner approach or a story that we might tell, which is that, look, we have various aims regarding society, the world we live in, and for potentially complicated reasons, uh, engaging in certain behaviors, expressing certain emotions, praising people, blaming them, and so on, which is really just a set of behaviors. I'm not saying there's something stronger we're committing to there. That's instrumental to that. It helps because those activities have some influence on people. They tend to respond or in the future behave in ways that are instrumental to those aims we have for society. And in that sense, those sorts of practices are justified because they help to, maybe this sort of Pavlovian way, I don't know, encourage this behavior and character that we would prefer. And well, I could add something more, but I don't know if you, what do you think about that so far?
So I'd want to know more about why, at that level of description, we have a responsibility system. So I think you might think something like, well, you could think all of morality plays some role in realizing and encouraging people to get to the achievement of goods. But I think that the responsibility system has a very distinctive logic and structure to it. So that would be part of what I think we would need to fill in some of the details about how and why we get that particular structure. And I think those are some of the things that the kind of account I like. Um, it's got the resources to explain things like, why do we have backward looking assessments? Why do we have backward looking assessments that are asking about the kinds of agents that are committing the wrongs? And we need a story about why, for example, we seem to think negligence counts as culpable. And so all of that kind of, at that level of granularity, when we start looking at the things that we tend to relatively readily recognize as part of our responsibility practices, but they have very distinctive explanatory logical structures to them. Those are some of the things for which I think it's going to turn out that we need some of the broader apparatus of the particular account I was giving. And it put that way, I think, and this is not a view that everybody holds, but I think part of what's illuminating about this is that responsibility turns out to be, as it were, an adjunct of morality. It's a thing that you could imagine a society that doesn't have it, but I do think that there are advantages to having it. So there's advantages to having a responsibility system. It does things for us, even if, as a kind of conceptual matter, you can imagine a society that gets along just fine with kind of airtake kinds of things. So they've got virtues and vices, and people are generous and courageous, but nobody's ever culpable. It's just there are these assessments about whether or not the behavior was generous or not, and so it does without that kind of broadly deontic sort of backwards looking fault finding elements. And put that way, I guess I do think we get some advantages from the responsibility system, but it's also, and I do think, for example, this is where some of my current back and forth with Dirk Pereboom, my co-author on the Four Views on Free Will book, where I think there are kind of interesting issues that we're still trying to sort out about whether or not we do better at achieving the various kinds of goals and interests that we have, the norms, the value commitments, and so on, with a responsibility system or without, or how much of a responsibility system, or how, like what structure would it need to have. I think that's where a lot of the action is for at least, those of us sort of thinking about the differences between, different kinds of revisionist accounts, or things that where you're on the line between a revisionism and a eliminativism about responsibility, which way you would go.
Yeah, good. I guess I would have to fill in more, or at least try to fill in more, to see if what I'm describing can be properly called a responsibility system. I suspect that, well, the things you brought up in terms of this backward-looking stuff and the other stuff you mentioned, I think probably could be accommodated. But I'll skip over some of that for now and cut to the chase, or regarding the concern that I wanted to get to, which was that it could, like, the model that I'm suggesting might make it so that well, it's consistent maybe with various forms of like emotivism, non-cognitivism, or just the thought that there's just these are just behaviors and sounds that we generate because it serves some functional and instrumental role, but it needn't and perhaps doesn't have any meaning or anything behind it. Even if in fact it does when we use it, it would still be that's not what's like serving the instrumental value. It's these other features that like it has certain effects on people that help to achieve these ends that we have regarding society. And well, I don't know if I express this in the best way, but do you sort of understand what I'm saying?
So, so let me see if I've got the worry right. Lots of people in the responsibility literature talk as though they were realists, but you might think that some kind of anti-realism or emotivism is true about normative properties, and if you thought that, then you might think the same is true about talk about moral responsibility. And so, why not go in for a kind of sentimentalism and instrumentalism, and then we don't do, and then we can just do without the realist talk. Is that the kind of worry you have in mind?
Sort of. It's not necessarily a claim about. Look, the idea is maybe put better this way. We're trying to find out, are these practices justified, and the responsibility practices of praising and blaming and so on. And well, I'm thinking that we might find justification, instrumental justification, in certain behaviors that we engage in, certain like utterances that we make to people, and that might be enough, right? The other things that we might add in that, like, well, we're really committing to them being at fault in some sense, whatever that means, that might be not adding any instrumental value over and above the practices that needn't have that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. So I think these issues are really delicate issues, and so I think I think I have a sense of the kind of the sets of issues that you're raising, and so let me take a stab at reconstructing the worry in maybe slightly different vocabulary. So there's a kind of disagreement that Tori McGeer and I have about how to think about instrumentalism, about responsibility. So I'm inclined to think that if we want to capture a lot of our practices as we find them and to provide a justification for them, we need to have a certain amount of backward lookingness in it. And then this pushes us in a direction of having, allowing in some things like dessert talk and backward looking assessments, and decoupling a purely forward looking story from being systematic all the way through. And Tori thinks, well, that's nice, but we could do even better. The way we could do even better is let's just make it all forward looking. And so then it just turns out that the relevant question is, do we blame or not? And does blaming get us the instrumental good or not? And then we don't need all of this extra baggage about, do they satisfy certain kinds of agential conditions, or, do they satisfy some backward looking dessert assessment, or, we fill out all the details about the ways in which the theories go apart. And then, then she thinks this is a kind of, as it were, a more efficient theory, or a more efficient way to capture the core instrumentalist insight. I guess I think, that's a possibility, but it seems to me a possibility that comes at a couple of different kinds of costs. So one is, I do think that, though I take myself to be committed to revisionist theorizing, that there is some pressure to be cautious or modest in one's revisionism, partly because the possibility of success of a revisionist theory requires uptake. And it seems to me the more radical and divergent a practice is from where we find it, it's harder to get people to take it on board. We have already a big pre-existing standing commitment to talk about desert, and I think it's not implausible that there is good justification for and good ways of understanding what desert talk comes to. So I think this is work that I don't pretend to have done, and I think that there's ample room for people to think and say a lot about this. My colleague David Brink has a very nice treatment about how to think about the notion of desert that's at stake in these ways. But you might think there's a kind of potential independent ground for desert-like constraints on the responsibility practices. And so if you did, then that would be a reason for thinking not only is there a kind of broadly conceptual uptake, kind of pragmatic constraint on how radical the revision is, but there's also an independent normative constraint on how far the instrumentalism goes down. The instrumentalism is going to be constrained in various ways by desert considerations. And so I think if you thought that, and Tori doesn't think that, so Tori's happy to walk away from desert talk and happy to walk away from the backward-looking element. She's a thoroughgoing consequentialist. And I think that if you are, or at any rate about this, she's a thoroughgoing consequentialist. Then I think you incur these, or maybe one way to put it is the minimalism about one's instrumentalism comes at the cost of more robust commitments in normative ethical theory and more robust commitments about the prudential or the practical uptake of the theory. And for my part, I'm inclined to think I want to be as neutral about what turns out to be the true normative ethical theory, and I want to be as neutral as possible about the kind of the meta ethics of these things, and to rely on resources that are fairly widely accepted. But if one rejects the desert base, then I think then it looks like all you've got is kind of comparing two sets of practices, some that have backward-looking features and some that don't, and then asking which one does better at cultivating sensitivity to moral considerations over time. And there, I don't know how to weigh that out. I mean, I'm inclined to think for various, sometimes difficult to articulate reasons that we do better with some of the backwards looking things, and not just because we're invested in it, but partly because of being able to anticipate and control, and a kind of that how our moral psychologies happen to have been set up. The ones that we've acquired, that there is a kind of worry about being treated in purely systematically instrumental ways. But none of these, I take it, are decisive against a kind of leaner, meaner version of instrumentalism. And so I don't know if that dialectic captures the kind of concern you had, but I think it is a real issue for real in-house issue for those of us who are attracted to instrumentalist approaches.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I know it's a tricky and surely contentious issue. Yeah. I do wonder, though, that someone could try to instrumentally justify some backward-looking practices, even on an ultimately forward-looking goal, right? So, maybe having concern for things in the past and responding based on how they were in the past is ultimately instrumental to something forward-looking. So maybe that there would be a way to justify some of this desert or backward-looking stuff on instrumentalist grounds.
Yeah, I mean, so in many moods, that's the kind of view I have. I mean, that is, I think, I think there's an open question about to what extent there are independent constraints for backward-looking desert-based judgments. And so I think that's an open question in some sense, that for which I'm not confident about what the answer is to it. But I do think I'm very sympathetic to the idea that there are pretty robust forward-looking reasons for a practice with backward-looking features, and the kind of example that I take to be paradigmatic, and it's a kind of example I've been pushing since I guess 2007 in the Four Views on Free Will book, about the idea think about how foul calls work. So in a sport, we've got foul calls. Foul calls are super important for the safety of the players. But we want to structure the foul calls not just for the safety of the players, but also in such a way that it isn't massively disruptive on the game and the enjoyment of the spectators and so on. And so we've got these kind of design constraints on how to have foul calls, but we need the foul calls because, of course, sports without any foul calls would be super fun for the first 5 minutes and then a disaster after that. And so we've got an instrumental justification for foul calls, but how do the foul calls have to work? They've got to be backwards looking, right? So they in order for the foul calls to be successful and to avoid easy gaming on them and to try to as it were to cheat the foul calls, then it has to be that they're backwards looking and that the propriety of the application of it turns on whether or not those backward looking conditions were satisfied. So did the player do the thing that counts as the foul? And notice, that there can be limit cases, of course, where it's familiar to sports fans everywhere. We can have arguments about whether or not somebody ought to have called the foul. But that's a different kind of argument than arguments about whether or not it was a foul. And whether or not something is a foul depends on the behavior and what the rules say. And it's settled entirely in that kind of backward looking, what do the rules say at the time and what was the behavior at the time. But its justification is forward looking. And I think that's a nice model of what's going on in a lot of our blaming practices, as I'm inclined to understand them, is that we have good forward-looking justification for strict backward-looking principles. And so whether or not you were blameworthy is, I think, a strict backward-looking principle that is the basis of it is it's part of a practice that the function of the practice gets us these pro-social goodies and the building better being story and the various instrumental benefits that come from being the kinds of creatures disposed to engage in coordination, cooperation.
Right. All right. I had a couple more questions, and then we can wrap up in a few minutes. Let's go with you. So moving back to something else on free will, there's a certain sort of objection, or maybe family of objections to libertarianism, which are based on luck. So the basic thought is that, look, if libertarianism is true, we have libertarian free will, and that requires indeterminism, then whether we perform a certain action is partly a matter of, or rather than another, is partly a matter of chance, because nothing antecedent in us or anything else determined that we chose A over B when we had a libertarian free choice between A and B. And this is especially concerning when, say, only one of A and B are like morally negative or positive. And the thought is that, well, how can we hold someone responsible for performing A when it wasn't by some, like, I don't know, intention or desire or whatever that they had that explains why they chose A rather than B, which wouldn't have had that same, wouldn't have warranted that same moral response. So yeah, I don't know if you want to comment on this. I know you have the stuff about compatibilism, and but yeah, if you want to jump in there.
Yeah, so this is in the literature sometimes called the luck objection, and there's a kind of long history of philosophers raising some version of the luck objection against libertarian accounts. And so I think it's an important and pretty central objection, or it's certainly a part of the terrain in a really kind of important way for a lot of thinking about free will. I'm inclined to think that there are things that can be said to blunt the force of the luck objection, but they sometimes require thinking things that no right-minded libertarian would want to think, or at any rate, I don't think I've ever convinced anybody that anything that I'm about to say here is remotely plausible. So thank you for entertaining this conversation. So here's the kind of the it's a sort of two-stage thought. So one is, and I think a number of other people have made this point too, is that there is something funny about contemporary compatibilists complaining about the luck problem. in that it sure looks like contemporary compatibilists. If the luck problem is a problem for libertarians, it's a problem for contemporary compatibilists, because, of course, as you know, compatibilists typically hold the view that free will is compatible with both determinism and indeterminism. And if indeterminism is supposed to be the thing that generates the luck and generates the luck problem for libertarians, then it looks like it should generate that problem for compatibilists. And so that's an observation I think a number of people have made. Now, I guess I'm inclined to think, well, there's a couple of different ways we could go on this, but I'm inclined to think that one possibility is to go in the direction of thinking that compatibilists might well have an okay answer to the luck problem. And if compatibilists have an okay answer to the luck problem, well, that's good news for compatibilists. But it might be good news for for at least some libertarians. And so some libertarians have maintained that they're prepared to accept all of the standard compatibilist conditions, but then there's this additional requirement that, in fact, indeterminism obtain. And so part of the bit of crazyism in this paper is the thought that, well, maybe you could imagine a kind of libertarian who thinks, I can take on board whatever the right compatibilist solution is to the luck problem. And all that it's costing me is this additional requirement that I can be able to explain why it is that we need the indeterminism or the non-determinism to get us libertarianism. But the luck element will have been addressed by whatever this compatibilist solution is. And so call those libertarians piggybackers. And the argument of this paper is that there is some reason to think that compatibilists do have an answer to the question. And if the compatibilists do have an answer to the question, then it's one that libertarians can help themselves to, or at least some libertarians.
Right. Yeah, and I thought there was a pretty compelling point. Now, maybe for like more, I don't know if it's the right terminology, but like classical compatibilists, or ones that thought that no, determinism is true, and we have free will, and maybe they would reject that we could have free will if indeterminism were true. This wouldn't. I mean, maybe for them they could avail themselves of this objection. Maybe it wouldn't undermine their own view, or there wouldn't be this response on the behalf of the libertarian. I guess it's not as common of a view nowadays.
That's right. I think most contemporary compatibilists are what I call super compatibilists, in that they think, yeah, it's not just that free will is compatible with determinism, but that it's compatible with both determinism and indeterminism.
Right. Yeah, and then also in that paper you explore a couple of options for how, well, the libertarian might respond in a more substantive way than just piggybacking. And I took your basic idea being like, look, if we have maybe your theory of the responsibility practices and so on is right, that can be justified, and it can tolerate this sort of indeterminism or luck in the way that people act, and so it's just not an issue then on this view of free will. I mean, is that roughly the way you would put it in brief? Or
yeah, I think that's a good characterization of what at least I think a family of broadly compatibilist stories has to be about the luck problem. Is that we can take them on board. There's different kinds of luck and the kinds of luck that matter. The kinds of luck that are undermining of freedom and responsibility. It's not just from the raw fact of indeterminism.
Yeah. So I wonder if someone were to object in the following sort of way. It's like, okay, we might have some instrumental reason for engaging in these practices that you may be right about, but also we have opposing instrumental reason to not blame people for some action where that action is that they perform that action rather than another, which we wouldn't blame them for, is not up to them. It's some matter of luck or something like that. Maybe we have some instrumental reason to restrict our reactive attitudes in that way. And then the matter would be, well, what these things are in opposite, like our reasons here are opposing. Where does it come out in the balance? And maybe it comes out in not holding them blameworthy. I don't know. Like, do you see the sort of dialectic that someone might have here?
Yeah, I mean, so here I'll just recast some of the argument that's in the paper. In that, I think, well, okay, so I guess we'll just edit this out here as I'm hemming and hawing about how to respond here. But so here's one way of thinking about this. So take an example again to appeal to the sports idea. So suppose that we've got a sport that is very much like soccer. Maybe in fact it is soccer, where if somebody comes sliding in, cleats up, it's dangerous. But we think we're not going to call a penalty so long as you get to the ball first. And so now what we've done is we've introduced an incentive for players to be cautious about their play in a way that will reduce the rate of injury for opposing players, because now you have to be willing to really kind of risk a serious penalty, or you have to be confident enough to be willing to risk that you're going to get to that ball first. Otherwise, you're going to have to eat a non-trivial penalty. So the good news is it saves a bunch of ankles over time. But you can imagine that it might well turn out that near the margins of human physical performance and human perceptual abilities, that we could just stipulate that it just turns out that this is in fact an indeterministic phenomena there at the margins of it, where players are going to they've got to make a judgment call. But not only is it a judgment call, but it's actually indeterministic whether or not the judgment call looks clearly one way rather than another. Or even if you want, we can even stipulate that it's indeterministic about whether or not they do things one way rather than another. I think in that kind of case, however we end up filling out those details, I think it's still going to turn out to be true that we are better off with a practice that has that structure of saying, well, look, if you get there first, we're not going to call it a penalty. But if you don't get there first, we are going to call it a penalty. And that's a practice that is a luck tolerating practice in a limited kind of context. And notice that even if we knew that there was this indeterminism in either the perceptual system or in the judgment about whether or not to go for it under these limit kinds of conditions, notice that even if we knew all of that, and somebody said, oh man, I got the penalty, but look, it was a matter of luck that I got the penalty, I think there would be a collective shrugging of everybody watching the game. I mean, maybe some teammates would come over and say, oh, that's a bad break that you got the penalty. I would have made the same call in your position. It's too bad that, the luck of the perceptual dice or the luck of the perceptual or the motivational dice went the way it did. But, that we don't think you were being irresponsible, but it was a limit case. Or you can imagine people coming in and saying, something quite the opposite. That is, there was some luck there, but stop your whining. Them's the rules, and them's good rules.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So, in a way, that might be like saying, even if the fact that there's some indeterminism here might, to some degree, count against holding them responsible or something like that, on the whole, we just do have these strong reasons to maintain those responsibility practices there and hold them responsible.
Good. Yeah. So I think this is exactly the right way to think about it. So it's not that there is no cost at all, right? I mean, I think it's right that we do have some intuitions of fairness here, and this is one sense in which I think, it is not as though there aren't there aren't places of normative friction, I think, even on the best theory of freedom and responsibility. I think that we're not going to expunge them all. And I think this is I think you nicely identified one of the places where this emerges, where we think there is something unfair here, and I think we could be pretty explicit and clear, and even get a fair amount of convergence about what we think is unfair. But I don't think we would get much convergence that it's unfair on balance. It's just there is this feature of the practice that it's a kind of, in some sense, the cost of doing business, the cost of having a practice that is effective in so many other ways that it's going to be normatively infelicitous in certain contexts or in certain kinds of situations that we might be able to pretty clearly identify and point to. And there might be no good modification of the practice that would get rid of this problem. Like it's baked into having a practice that gets these kinds of goodies for us, given the kinds of creatures we are, and we're not going to do better than this. And I think in many respects, that's where we are with this. So I think people who are really worried about there's something cosmically unfair about praising and blaming in a deterministic universe, in some sense, I want to think, we're not going to expunge that fact. But there can be better and worse ways of living with a certain important and very real kind of indeterminism. And I think that, of a kind of unfairness that I think there might well be some real unfairness there, but it doesn't, that fact doesn't overturn all of the grounds and justification we have for having a practice, despite the fact of that degree of unfairness. And I think that is a, it's one of the consolations, I guess, of normative philosophy is the learning to recognize and live with the normative infelicities of the world as we find it.
Yeah, very good. That actually makes a lot of sense to me. So yeah, there's more things, of course, that we could discuss there, but I do want to end with the question that I like to end with, which is, what do you think is the value of philosophy? I mean, why is philosophy, on your view, like worth doing, perhaps personally, but also as a discipline in our society?
So, I think the value of doing philosophy doesn't have a single and uniform answer. I think there's a lot of philosophy that is maybe not worth doing, and I think that that there's a lot of philosophy that has been done both by individuals and by communities that produce philosophy. And I think it's important to remember that philosophy isn't just produced by individuals. It's against a background of a bunch of enabling conditions to allow people to do philosophy, and those enabling conditions can vary widely from time and place. But I guess I think the kind of highbrow answer to this question about what's the value of philosophy is, well, it's the discipline that gave us all the rest. So if you think there was any payoff of having economics or sociology or political science or computation theory or or physics for that matter, these are all as a matter of the actual history of how these things unfolded. These are things that grew out of people engaged in this enterprise that they call and thought of as philosophy, and that over time, as we began to get convergence around methods and presumptions in an area, and they begin to hook onto the world in a kind of robust enough way, we began to get the emergence of these independent sciences. So I think when somebody asks what's the benefit of virtue of philosophy, I think, well, that gigantic mountain of human intellectual and empirical achievement that depended on having advanced foot soldiers, as it were, trying to reconnoiter the frontiers of reason and knowledge and information and the construction of the world. And yeah, it was going to be really undisciplined and unorganized and full of lots of false theories. But that's the price we have to pay to be in the business of isolating and finding truths in a systematic way. So I think what's the benefit of doing philosophy? It's the first pass foundational effort at expanding the scope of human knowledge and the building of fields and the creation and manufacturing of the academy, which conveniently enough, of course, was the name of Plato's school of philosophy that has carried through to today, about how the kind of the collective enterprise of knowledge generating works. So that's the kind of big picture highbrow answer. What's the value of philosophy as a kind of individual personal answer, I think, can vary quite widely. For some people, I remember Richard Wollheim, an undergraduate teacher of mine, once when he was asked this question, his reply was something to the effect of, "Well, look, there's just some stuff I want to know, and philosophy is my attempt to try to answer these questions that have really kind of bothered me personally." And so I think in some sense, for some folks, it's like that. And I think there is a kind of satisfaction that happens to some of us, as the psychologists would describe, a high need for cognition folks, the satisfaction of trying to work through problems and try to understand things for which we don't have widely agreed upon and reliable methods for figuring out what the truth is. Last thing I'll say is a kind of middle level answer, and this is an answer that I think is not at the level of collective high scale human knowledge generation, nor at the level of being responsive to individual demands to try to see, understand, and know. But sometimes I think one of the values of philosophy is that it provides a community, and I do mean a community, an opportunity to articulate what its presumptions are. Not because we're necessarily going to get a science out of it, but because it is an effort at sometimes collective self-understanding. And I think that's a really kind of interesting and sometimes distinctive effort of communities that can be very varied, time and place and so on, to try to articulate how they understand the world and how it hangs together and what its relationship to other things can be, even if it's not in some strict sense a knowledge-generating enterprise or a discipline-generating enterprise. I think there can be sometimes some value in seeing how communities have understood the world to hang together, because at the very least, it gives us some sense about the kind of the scope and meaning of what it is to be human and what kinds of things we can think about.
That's an excellent answer. I share that sentiment across the board, I would say. So yeah, I think we'll end the questions there. Thanks so much for being here and sharing your time and answering and taking my questions and providing some very thoughtful answers. It's been really great having you.
Thanks so much for having me, and good luck with the podcast going forward. I think it's an amazing thing that you're doing here, and really kind of a real service to the profession of philosophy, the business and discipline of philosophy, because I think the opportunity to do these in-depth interviews with folks when you're not at the university and where their work is oftentimes in an ivory tower somewhere, I think it's super awesome to, as it would, bring this to the world. So thank you for doing it.